Good evening. I'm Patrick Lewis, scholar in residence at the Filson Historical Society. It is my pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, Megan Kate Nelson. Dr. Nelson is a writer and historian living in Lincoln, Massachusetts. She has written about the Civil War, U.S. Western history, and American culture for the New York Times, the Washington Post, Smithsonian Magazine, Preservation Magazine, and Civil War Monitor. Nelson earned her BA in History and Literature from Harvard University and her PhD in American Studies from the University of Iowa. She has taught at Texas Tech University, Cal State Fullerton, Harvard, and Brown. Nelson is the author of Trembling Earth, A Cultural History of the Okefenokee Swamp, Ruined Nation, Destruction and the American Civil War, and the subject of tonight's presentation, The Three-Cornered War, the Union, the Confederacy, and Native peoples in the fight for the West. Please welcome Dr. Nelson.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks to Patrick for that introduction. And thank you all for being here. I wish I could have been with you in person. I was scheduled to be so, but that obviously didn't work out. So I hope that everyone is at home and staying safe and that you are well. And I'd like to thank also all the team at the Filson for putting this virtual event together. I know it's been really hard for institutions in this dark and strange time, but the Filson really made the transition to virtual really quickly and seamlessly. So thank you to them for providing me with this opportunity to be with you here tonight in this virtual way. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from the traditional lands of the Wampanoag peoples. So I'm here tonight to talk to you about the topics around my recently published book, The Three-Cornered War, which tells the story of the Civil War in the desert Southwest. So most of the action takes place in New Mexico and Arizona, with some other kinds of action in West Texas and Colorado and Southern California. Now, this is not a theater of the war. I think most people are used to thinking about or talking about or reading about. And even Civil War historians rarely engage with this far Western theater. And this is part of the reason that I actually started the research for the book. I'm from Colorado, and growing up, I had no idea that there were battles between Union and Confederate forces in New Mexico. I also had no idea that Colorado soldiers were involved in that fight, that they signed up for the Union Army and defended both New Mexico territory and the larger West from Confederate invasion. And, you know, as a historian, whenever I find out something, there's something that I don't know about a field I thought I knew all about, that actually, you know, really kind of spurs me in the direction of research. So I really wanted to know kind of what happened in this theater of the war and why we don't really talk about it. So let's go to that first question. What happened and why were the Union and the Confederacy in the Southwest in the first place, starting in the summer of 1861? Well, both the Union and the Confederacy wanted control of the West for a couple of reasons. The first major reason was money. As we all know, it takes a lot of money to fight wars. And the West had gold mines, not only in the California Sierras, but also more recently discovered in the Rocky Mountains. So those gold mines were quite valuable, and both the Union and the Confederacy wanted that gold to be able to pay the costs of their war efforts. Second, they both wanted control of the deep water ports of the Pacific coast. So this is especially important for the Confederacy because already by the summer of 1861, there had already been ships in the water blocking ports in the Atlantic and in the Gulf of Mexico. And so that blockade, the Confederates knew was going to become quite problematic in the near future. And so they wanted those ports in Southern California, particularly San Diego and Los Angeles. They also thought that if they could take control of this entire western segment, sort of as you can see on this map from West Texas all the way to California, that they would then control the entire border with Mexico, and they could create an alliance with that country that might give them access to the Gulf of California, which would also be very useful for them. And of course, for the Union, it was in their best interest to prevent the Confederacy from gaining control of any of those ports to ship out their cotton and sustain their war effort. And then there's this third reason, which is more about a kind of vision for the future. Throughout the 1850s, Northerners and Southerners were fighting about the West and the future of the West. Would there be slavery in the territories in the state, and the states of 40% of the nation's landmass? And this kind of continued during the Civil War. And this is what I find really interesting. A lot of Civil War historians sort of drop that entirely. It's as if the firing on Fort Sumter meant that everyone stopped thinking about the West and its function kind of in the nation. And that, in fact, is not true, as I argue in the Three-Cornered War. The Union saw the West as part of their vision of an empire of free labor, that this would be where white farmers and ranchers and miners would be able to go freely, take up land and settle and make the land productive. Southerners, on the other hand, white Southerners, saw the West as a really integral part of their expanding empire of slavery. They wanted to be able to expand slavery into the Western territories, and they figured if they could expand all the way and kind of take Southern California, that they would have this empire of slavery coast to coast, and that would kind of give them this fully integrated nation that would mean that they could sort of expand into other parts of the West and perhaps even south into Mexico or Latin America. So these were really the goals. And in the summer of 1861, a US Army officer named Henry Hopkins Sibley resigned his commission and went to Richmond and pitched Jefferson Davis on this plan to invade New Mexico territory with soldiers from Texas. He would sustain his army on the road with their own beef herd and lots of supplies, and then he would sack fort after fort after fort, take those provisions and all those guns, and then use New Mexico territory to sort of launch a campaign for the larger West. Jefferson Davis endorsed this plan, and everything was set in motion in the summer of 1861. Now, before Sibley's troops kind of got underway, there was actually an initial invasion of New Mexico territory by a smaller group of Texans, about 300 Texas Mounted Rifles under the leadership of John Robert Baylor, who I will be talking about here in more detail here soon, born in Kentucky, but had lived in Texas for the previous kind of 15 years of his life. And he and these 300 mounted soldiers rode into New Mexico territory in late July 1861. They took the town of Mesilla in southern New Mexico territory and forced the surrender of Fort Fillmore and 400 of its federal troops. On August 1st, 1861, right after that happened, Baylor sat down and put pen to paper and created the Confederate Territory of Arizona, which you can see on this map. This is one of the rare kind of visual images we have of the Confederacy's expanding empire in this moment, where you can see Baylor's Confederate Territory of Arizona, which has very different borders than we know today. The reason for that is that it was fairly well known that the southern part of New Mexico territory was filled with pro-Southerners, that they had sort of migrated directly westward. And so the Anglos there were pro-Southern, they were pro-secession and pro-slavery. So Baylor created this territory in the summer of 1861. And at that moment, the Confederacy did in fact extend from the Atlantic Ocean to the Colorado River. So Sibley's troops followed in the fall of 1861, kind of fall winter, and by January of 1862 were installed both in El Paso and then a little further north in Mesilla, and then a fort called Fort Thorne. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the actions that I've listed here for you, but I thought it would be useful for you to have a timeline. The Confederates began marching northward in February of 1862. They clashed with a Union Union Army under E.R.S. Canby, also born in Kentucky, at the Battle of Valverde, which is in central New Mexico. The Confederates won that battle, continued marching north, took Albuquerque, took Santa Fe. They were the first and only Confederate army to take a Union capital during the war. They had a problem though, once they got to Santa Fe. That whole plan that I had mentioned before, Sibley's plan to sustain his troops on the road, was not working. In order to fight the Battle of Valverde, Sibley had sort of gone around Fort Craig and had not been able to take that fort or any of its provisions. So his soldiers were on half rations, and what they really needed was to take all of the supplies at Fort Union, which was a huge military installation to the northeast of Santa Fe on the Santa Fe Trail. So they started there in March of 1862 and ran into Union troops, Colorado soldiers that had been recruited for this purpose, and they fought to a draw at Apache Canyon, and then the Confederates won at Glorieta Pass again. However, a contingent of Union troops got around their rear and burned their entire wagon train. And without that wagon train, Sibley's troops could not sustain their campaign to take the West. And they started a very long retreat they went to Santa Fe first, and then they went all the way back to San Antonio, Texas, more than a 1,000-mile retreat. Now, I should note, throughout these engagements between the Union and the Confederacy, Apache and Navajo raiders were continually taking bites out of Union and Confederate armies. They were raiding them mostly for animals, for horses and mules and cattle, but also for provisions and weapons. And they were attacking forts and wagon trains on the march and corrals. And they were pretty successful at it. They took advantage, very much so, of this Union-Confederate war that was happening in their own territories. So as the Confederates were retreating back to Texas in April, from April to July 1862, there was another Union Army on the move from Los Angeles under the leadership of James Henry Carleton. This army of 2,000, mostly gold miners from California, came to the Rio Grande in a couple months of marching through the desert in spring and summer. They fought one battle with Chiricahua Apaches at Apache Pass, which is now in Arizona, but at that point still in New Mexico territory. And when Carleton arrived on the Rio Grande in the fall, kind of August of 1862, he moved upriver, went to Santa Fe, and then took command of the Department of New Mexico from E.R.S. Canby, who was then sent east to command troops there. And at this point, James Henry Carleton formulated and then instigated the Union Army's next campaigns, which were focused on taking lands away from Mescalero Apaches, Chiricahua Apaches, and Navajos. These were hard wars. They were fought by a much smaller army, but a contingent of 400 to 500, under the leadership mostly of Kit Carson, who I will also talk about later, but someone you probably associate with the West, but not necessarily with the Civil War. Carson was especially successful against the Navajo people, who he forced to surrender in the winter of 1864, or most of them, and the Union Army forcibly removed, by the end of it, about 10,000 Navajo people from their homeland, 400 miles all the way to Bosque Redondo, which was a reservation that really functioned as a Union prisoner of war camp on the Pecos River in central New Mexico territory. The final kind of 1/3 of the book really focuses on these Indian campaigns, and Three Cornered War argues that the Civil War in this region at this moment was in fact an Indian war. So as you can probably tell just from that brief overview, this is a very complicated theater of war. It involves a lot of different communities who are marching across thousands of miles of territory and representing all kinds of different ideologies and beliefs in their struggle for control over the West. So my challenge in thinking about and researching this theater of the war and this moment in Civil War history was how to convey all that complexity, but still give readers a sense of who these people were on the ground and what communities they were a part of. And as I was doing the research, I was also reading a great deal of both literary and trashy fiction. And I noticed a trend that was demonstrated most sort of starkly, if I may make that pun, by Game of Thrones, which is both a set of novels and a TV series that use something called multi-perspective narrative. So that the reader starts with one kind of protagonist and then moves to another one. You're continually moving forward in time, but you are getting the perspectives of different people in different places. And sometimes those people come together, as they do 3 different times in the Three Cornered War. So I took up this kind of fictional strategy in order to write this nonfiction story. And I chose ultimately 9 different protagonists. So I'm going to introduce them to you very briefly here and then talk more specifically about kind of 2 to 3 of them, but really one of them. So James Henry Carleton, who I spoke about as bringing the California column from Los Angeles to the Rio Grande, is a major figure from the beginning to the end of the book. He was a career Army officer, and he is pretty much solely responsible for turning the Civil War into an Indian War in this theater. Union soldier Alonzo Ickes fought under Carleton against Native peoples in a couple of battles before Carleton kicked him and his Colorado company out of the territory for their horrible behavior. Ickes had come to the West from Iowa as part of the Colorado Gold Rush. So readers will learn a lot about those circumstances by following Alonzo Ickes. Carleton also fought a battle, as I noted, against Chiricahua Apaches at Apache Pass. And one of the leaders of that band was Mangus Coloradus, who was 70 years old at this point in the war and still a very powerful war leader and political leader and diplomat of his people. I don't have a visual image of him. He never sat for a photograph. No one ever produced an illustration of him that was not a racial caricature. So we don't really know what he looked like. So instead I have given you an image here of Apache Pass, the site of that clash between Carleton's troops and the Chiricahua Apaches. Union civilian John Clark is probably the person you have never heard about before in the context of the West or American history. He was the Surveyor General of New Mexico Territory, and he was the representative of the Lincoln administration and the Republican government in New Mexico during this period. His 25 volumes of diaries are at the Fray Angelico Chavez Library at the New Mexico History Museum. And he was an amazing diarist, and I was very lucky to find his materials as sources. Confederate soldier Bill Davidson was one of these rank and file guys, a little bit like Alonzo Ickes. He was from around the Houston area, was a lawyer, signed up for the Sibley's Army and was a full believer, even though he was not himself a slave owner, a full believer in the Confederate cause and was in fact pro-slavery, and really signed up to do all that he could to forward the Confederate cause in the West. Davidson was kind of excited, this is very interesting, to know that he was fighting Kit Carson at the Battle of Valverde. Kit Carson was probably the person you know most about of these 9 protagonists. He was definitely the most famous person in the Southwest in the 1860s as well. Almost every other protagonist kind of mentioned him at some point, either mentioned meeting him or wanting to meet him or having heard of him. Kit Carson was fluent in Spanish and conversant in several native languages, and so ERS Canby gave him command of the 1st New Mexico Volunteers, which was the Union Army that fought at Valverde, was the most diverse army in the Civil War. Had Anglo soldiers who were like Ickes, volunteers or Army regulars who had been in the Army in the frontier garrisons before the war. Also included Hispano New Mexican volunteers and militia, and also Pueblo scouts and spies. So Kit Carson was at the head of that effort, and then, as I noted, pivoted to hard war against Native peoples after the Confederates left the territory. I'm going to talk just a little bit more specifically about a couple of people. I knew that I had to start the story of the Three-Cornered War with John Robert Baylor. As I noted, he is one of the people born in Kentucky, Kit Carson also, and then E.R.S. Canby, Louisa Canby's husband. But Baylor's family came to Texas in the 1840s. They were lured there by the promise of rich cotton lands and the right to own slaves. He got married pretty quickly thereafter, and he is part of that family after whom Baylor University is named. One of his uncles was one of the founders of that university. And so he was part of this fairly powerful family. He was a farmer, a rancher. He enslaved men and women in both of those ventures. He read the law, became a lawyer, was elected to the state legislature, had designs on the governorship at one point, was an Indian agent for 2 years for Comanches in West Texas. And you would think that that experience would have made him more empathetic to Native peoples and their rights, but in fact it had the opposite effect. And Baylor came out of there a tried and true Indian hater. And in fact, he, in 1860, became the editor of a newspaper out of Weatherford, Texas called The White Man, whose only real purpose was to publish really incendiary stories about Comanche raids on Anglo-Texans in order to provoke people to kind of ride out in posses in raids of vengeance against Comanche peoples. So Baylor was really kind of primed and ready to join the Confederate Army. He recruited hundreds of soldiers himself. He was, by all accounts, a charismatic leader and a pretty able military officer, but he was also ambitious and resentful, petulant, and also easily bored. And this got him into a lot of trouble during his time in New Mexico territory. So readers will meet Baylor first as the vanguard of Confederate Manifest Destiny in July of 1861. Juanita was just a teenager when she married Manuelito, who was one of the most powerful headmen in Navajo country. And readers of the Three-Cornered War will follow her and Manuelito and their children as they fight and evade and negotiate with Union troops in the 1860s. And I really wanted to focus on Juanita because, first of all, I wanted a civilian story from the standpoint of Native peoples. And then I also thought it was important to highlight the very vital role that women played in Navajo society. As you can see here, this is a photograph from 1874, taken when Juanita went with Manuelito and a Navajo delegation to Washington, D.C. And she's pictured with weaving because she was already, during the Civil War in the 1860s, known for her talent in weaving. She made the dress that she is wearing, and she wove clothing and blankets, not only for her family, but for the Southwestern trade. And Navajo blankets, as they are today, were very highly valued. They were very well made, they were waterproof, and they lasted forever. And so they became part of this exchange economy in the Southwest. And I wanted to highlight the role of women in creating these material objects and really driving the economy of their people. So the readers of the Three-Cornered War, again, as I noted, will follow Juanita and her people through this whole story. She and Manuelito were able to resist Union efforts to force them to surrender until 1866, but then they were forced by starvation to surrender to the Union Army. So readers will follow her on the long walk from the homeland to Bosque Redondo, and then see Bosque Redondo from her point of view for the 2 years they were there before Manuelito had a hand in negotiating the Navajos' return to their homeland in 1868. I think more than anyone, Juanita is really the heart of the book. Her Civil War story is one of persistence and survival, and also one of suffering. But her story really does demonstrate how the war was a three-cornered war in the Southwest. And finally, another civilian, another woman who we can think of as kind of an army wife, Louisa Hawkins Canby. So Louisa Canby was born in Indiana. She was the oldest of 5 surviving children. And she met E.R.S. Canby, who actually went by Richard. She called him Richard, which is something I did not find out until I came to the Filson to do research on Louisa and her family. I had been calling him Edward the entire time. And so then I had to shift gears and start referring to him as Richard, which is what she and the entire family called him. So she met him when he was home from West Point in Indiana. She was about to go to college, to the Georgetown Female Collegiate Institute in Georgetown, Kentucky for 2 years. So she insisted that she finish her studies before they got married. And so that's in fact what happened. So in 1839, after she graduated, they got married. And then from that moment on, for the next 20 years, Louisa Canby went with Richard Canby to almost all of his postings across the country. The 2 of them were in California in 1850 for the statehood fight. They were in Utah in the late 1850s for the Mormon War, and they went from there to Santa Fe in 1860 so that Richard could lead a campaign against Navajo peoples. And actually his second command in that campaign was none other than Henry Hopkins Sibley. So they were there in Santa Fe when the war began, and Richard Canby went for the Union and stayed and was in command of troops. When he left to go take command of the army at Fort Craig and fight the Battle of Valverde, Louisa Canby stayed in Santa Fe. She stayed there also when the Union Army that was posted there abandoned the city as the Confederates came marching northward. And she was there when the Confederates arrived and took control of the city. So she was, in the term that Civil War historians have begun to use, she was kind of an occupied woman. She was a woman in an occupied city that was controlled by the enemy. She became most famous, actually, in the wake of the Battle of Glorieta Pass, when she organized all of the hospital supplies and food in order to help the Confederate wounded who came streaming back into Santa Fe after that battle. And she, in fact, was so revered by Confederate soldiers that they called her the Angel of Santa Fe. So I came to the Filson in the fall of 2017 to do a little more research on Louisa Canby. I was hoping to find more documents kind of in her voice because she, kind of to my surprise and frustration, did not seem to have written a diary of her extraordinary life, moving from frontier post to frontier post. Although, who knows, it could be out there. She also doesn't have very many surviving letters. And I knew that the Filson had at least one. I was hoping that there would be other letters from her kind of stashed in other places. But this is a photograph of the only letter that I have been able to find in her hand. It is from 1864, so it's after she left New Mexico. So it didn't really give me a sense of what her life was like in Santa Fe, but it did give me kind of a sense of her voice as a writer. And it also, as you can see in this smaller image, it gave me proof that she referred to herself and Richard referred to her as Lou, which was pretty great. And then I also was able to get this amazing image, this photograph of her, which was also taken later in the war in the 1860s after her New Mexico time, that is now published in the book. I went to the Filson not only to kind of find out more about Louisa Canby, but there was also this mystery about their daughter, Mary. Now, Mary had shown up in the census of 1850 in California as living in their household as Mary Paul Canby. And then there didn't seem to be much more evidence of her. At least the biographer of Richard Canby sort of suggested that Mary died as a child, which would not have been surprising given the 1850s and the nature of their travel. And so I was sort of wondering if I would find Mary anywhere. And in fact, I did. two of Louisa's sisters, Miriam and Margaret, were married to members of the Speed family. So several of their letters remained, and they were always inquiring after Mary. And so I was actually able to track her and know kind of where she was into the late 1850s. She did not, in fact, die. And then through the records of an officer who served with Richard Canby in the Mormon War in Utah, I was able to track her to the West in the late 1850s. So I knew she survived into her teenage years. But what I also found in the Canby Papers was a little note that noted that Mary Jane Paul was born in 1844 in Plattsburgh, New York. And that seemed strange. And so I hunted around. And in fact, there was a soldier with the surname Paul who was in the 2nd US Cavalry with Richard Canby and served with him in California and died there around the same time that Mary Paul Canby showed up in the census list. So was she adopted? Was she a ward? I really didn't know. And after 1859, Mary Canby kind of disappears from the record. She did not come to Santa Fe. It doesn't appear with the Canbys. There's no mention of her. And in all subsequent family histories, including one written by Louisa Canby's brother, John Hawkins, which is also at the Filson, Louisa Canby is referred to as childless. So this was a big mystery, and I actually have not been able to figure out what happened to Mary Canby. When I presented this issue to the research staff at the Filson in 2017, Leanne White said something really true, which is that women disappear from the historical record for 2 reasons: they die or they get married. So it's possible that Mary Canby got married and then went off, and we just don't have record of her because the documents just aren't there referring to her or her marriage. But again, I don't know, and I don't know why she seemed to disappear from their lives. So my only hope is that some of you out there have a stash of letters from either Mary Canby or Louisa Hawkins Canby somewhere in your attic, and that you find them and that you send them my way. But this is just one of the many research adventures that historians have. Sometimes we are not able to find out the ending or tell the full story, which can be frustrating, but it is a reality of the historical practice. So what do we learn from stories like Louisa Canby's and from looking at theater of the war that is really unexpected, a place like New Mexico territory? Well, I think you find out a couple things. I think you do find out that the war was a 3-cornered war that was fought between Union and Confederate troops and Native peoples, that the Civil War should be understood as a war between the North, the South, and the West, and that the war was fought between Anglo and Hispano and Native peoples. I think the book also suggests something that's kind of hard for us to grapple with, I think, which is that it complicates the whole notion of the Union's just war. Because at the same time, the Union Army is fighting for emancipation in the East, they are fighting for Native extermination, and if not that, removal in the West. And that both of those things, those were not contradictory to Republicans and to most white Northerners during the war. They were actually part of this larger vision of this empire of free labor in the West that was really rooted in the necessity of taking Native lands away from their original owners. So that can be troubling to think about, but I think it was a kind of hard reality of the Civil War. And I think it really shows us too that the war was not just fought in Virginia. It was not just of concern to Northerners and Southerners, that the Civil War was in fact a conflict that was continental, that extended from coast to coast, and that involved all the people living within and sometimes across its borders. So I just have one more kind of addendum. Usually my talk would end there, but the events of the last couple of weeks have brought Civil War monuments into kind of more relief, shown a spotlight on how we choose to memorialize these places and these events. And so I'm going to invite Patrick actually back into the talk now because hello, Patrick, because he is a public historian, I thought he would be quite interested in sort of discussing this, and perhaps this can be our sort of first discussion point or kind of conversation point about the Civil War and its memory in this place. So there are two monuments in Santa Fe, one to Union soldiers and one to Kit Carson, and they have come under fire, as you might imagine, in this moment. The first one is the monument to Union soldiers, which was, the plan for it was sort of hatched in 1867 and the money raised for it, and then it was dedicated in 1868. And actually readers of the Three-Cornered War will read about this because John Clark was one of the people who donated money, and he was present at the ceremony where they laid the cornerstone for this monument. The reason that this monument is so problematic and the reason that it is under fire is that on one face of the monument, it has inscriptions on all four sides, and on one face of it, it lauds Union soldiers for their battles against, and the term that was originally used on the monument plaque was savage Indians. So this monument has already been the target of protesters. In the 1970s, an American Indian movement activist came in broad daylight. He was actually Dene, he was Navajo, and he walked right up to the monument in broad daylight, was dressed in construction clothes and a blonde wig, and he chiseled out the word savage on the monument. So there had been an explanatory plaque there, which has now disappeared from the monument. But there was and this all just happened literally last week. Indigenous activists sent a letter to the mayor of Santa Fe saying that this monument and the Kit Carson monument and then another monument to a conquistador should be taken down in Santa Fe. And the mayor agreed. And so he gave a speech. He said that he was in favor of removing these monuments, and he was going to create a kind of truth and reconciliation commission to decide what to do with them and with these sites. So what had been planned as a protest became a kind of celebration last week in Santa Fe. And here you can see Indigenous activists who are gathered around the memorial after the event. And what they did was they had created a separate artwork with the handprints of Indigenous peoples. And then this was unplanned, I think. People went up and put their handprints on the memorial. Now, in the days since then, and earlier this week, this monument has been tagged in much the same way that the Lee Monument in Richmond has been tagged with the terms racist and genocide, and saying that this is marking it as Tewa land, a Pueblo land, and this is like late breaking news, Patrick. So this is very exciting. The city of Santa Fe has boarded up the monument as of right now, and they are inviting the residents of Santa Fe and any other interested artists to create artworks to post on that boarded up structure. So they're kind of converting it into an artwork. And I thought it was interesting, just a couple of days ago, an artist in Santa Fe tweeted out this image, which was his idea for kind of reconstituting this obelisk Union Monument as an artwork that would, and the bands are different rocks or different kind of stone from all over the world, which I thought was really interesting. I mean, this is, I think, one of the ways that we can productively think about these monument sites and re-envisioning them, turning them into shared spaces, turning them into spaces that celebrate communities and then also celebrate art, and instead of having something so divisive in a public space. And then this is the Kit Carson monument, which sits in front, it's actually off the plaza, and it sits in front of the US courthouse. It looks very much like the Union Soldiers Monument, obviously, but is in sandstone instead of granite. And it lauds Carson's career as a pioneer and a pathfinder and a soldier. And of course, all three of those roles that he played were roles in advance of settler colonialism, right? That we're going to take lands away often from their Hispano New Mexican owners, and then also their indigenous owners. So this, as you can see, has been tagged with stolen land. The city has put boarding around this monument as well. As far as I know, artists have not been invited to reimagine this space. But it is, again, this is where the far Western theater kind of complicates things, because these are not Confederate memorials, right? So they are more complicated than that. These are men who served in the Union Army, but their monuments are objectionable for other reasons. So what do you think about this, Patrick?
Well, I think this is really fascinating. I'm so glad that you brought up the timing of that Union Soldier Monument that you showed first. 1867-68 is incredibly early to have any kind of public monumentation. This is when the East is still bound up in Reconstruction, and the war is still very fresh and being fought literally in the countryside of the South still, and in the halls of Congress. So not only do we have, a Civil War monument in a place that we wouldn't expect it to, it comes before this wave of monumentation that we see in the 1880s and 90s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. And actually, there are ways that you can think of the plaza itself as a monument to the Union Army, because Union soldiers built it in 1862, like 62, 63, 64. So what we now know of is, if you've been to Santa Fe, this is like the major tourist attraction of the entire city. It's got radial pathways to the center where the obelisk is. And then there's the sort of band area in front of it. It sits right across from the Palace of the Governors, which is the oldest structure in town and in the entire Southwest. And Union soldiers built that. So that is a kind of fascinating element to this too. But yeah, very, very early memorialization. And one of the sides of that sign says, that this is dedicated by the people of Santa Fe, may the Union be perpetual. So this is, in the context of Reconstruction, very much. That they are putting this up. So the people of Santa Fe, the Anglos and Hispanos of Santa Fe, recognized the role that the Union Army played, and its dual role in fighting. And this is the other thing that complicates it too. These are not necessarily white supremacist monuments, because most of the Union soldiers who fought in these battles were Hispano New Mexican. So again, more complication. So I guess we'll see what happens in the coming weeks. Apparently there is a dispute now in terms of what to do with the obelisk, because people are trying to figure out who owns the land on which and who owns the obelisk itself. My contention would be that the people of Santa Fe own the obelisk. So they should be the ones to decide what to do with it, right? And, I'm hoping that there will be more artworks, and that there will be a lot of cooperation and a lot of indigenous voices also sort of determining what happens to these spaces. I think a lot of interesting things could happen. But yeah, you're totally right. Yeah, very early monuments. And even this one, the Kit Carson monument from 1885, is even a little bit early.
Yeah, no, that really is.
Yeah.
Well, and even that's fascinating before what we think of as the closing of the West too.
Right.
Like that, it's already it's not yet a process that is completed yet. It's already being commemorated.
Exactly.
Right. You kind of push it along in that way.
Yeah. Exactly. Yes.
I will note for everyone, and we've got a couple of questions in the chat already. Please, if you have questions for Megan, please post them down there. I'm going to let a little bit of time go so we can build up some more of those. But I wanted to pivot to commemoration of a different sort, and thinking about commemoration in the archive, right? Mm-hmm. And so the Filson as an organization is really founded to celebrate an earlier generation, of this move west, right? Like the part of the American Revolution that we don't think of in the taking of the land in the Ohio River Valley. And so the Filson is its early programming is built around that. Its early collections are built around celebrating, glorifying, justifying, documenting that. So I wondered about your experience in archives in the far West. Are any of them recognizing the legacies of their institutions, of their collections, and how that's perhaps narrowing the range, the diversity of narratives that historians are able to tell using their materials?
I think that's a really great question. I think my experience in most of the archives that I went to, which were either libraries like the Chavez Library, which is quite small, and now it doesn't even have opening hours. You just have to make you have to make an appointment to go in there privately, or they're university-based special collections, or kind of branches of the National Archives, things like that. So the thing about this particular theater of the war in this moment, the 1860s, is, as a Civil War historian and researching my previous book, there was more than I could ever hope to go through, right? Like more manuscript, there's so many letters, so many diaries, so many military records and newspaper articles and photographs and illustrations. And there just was a very small percentage of that in New Mexico and Arizona. So I think part of the challenge that archivists and curators have, for that period of history is just even finding anything. Finding anything that is still there and in good enough shape to preserve and to kind of situate and know kind of what it kind of means in the context of the other collections. And, some have strengths in more of the Hispano history. The University of New Mexico Special Collections Library has some really nice document collections there. But it's a little bit of a fragmented archive anyway. And so they're just trying to amass as much material and kind of get that metadata in there that it's Civil War history, right? And that's actually how I found the John Clark diaries at the Chavez Library, is that they were listed as Civil War documents. And I didn't even know really what I was going to find. And, I didn't know that a government functionary would become like one of my best sources of material in Southwestern history, because, his diaries really are remarkable. But I think that is the great challenge. And I'm not sure I think you'd have to ask them kind of how they're dealing then with the creation of the collections and what they are kind of promoting, or what people have access to in terms of the stories that those sources are telling. I mean, the vast majority of them are Anglo produced, many of them in English. There are a ton of military records. James Henry Carleton was actually, among other things, a frustrated novelist. He had wanted to be a novelist. He grew up in Maine. He wrote to Charles Dickens and sent him pages and asked if he could come to England and be a part of his literary set. And Dickens was like, no, maybe not. Maybe just, And so Carlton, joined the army. So yeah, we have Dickens to thank for that whole scenario, I think. But because he loved writing, and so he just wrote all the time. He was producing material every day, and it's all part of the record because of the record keeping in the Civil War period in the military in particular. But then there were other challenges like Louisa Canby, where I didn't have much from her. I had a lot built around her because of Richard Canby and because of her sisters marrying Speeds. And then so the Filson has a pretty good rounded out collection for them. But then for someone like Juanita, there are oral histories and material culture, nothing written, but all produced by Navajo historians, which is amazing, and amazing that we have access to them as non-Navajo historians.
Absolutely. Move into the chat now. A quick question. Where in Indiana was Louisa Canby born?
Oh, see, now you're gonna catch. I'm like, oh wait. No, I'm not gonna recall it. But if you would like to email me, meganknelson.com, you can contact me through there, and I can get you that information. Yeah, both she and Richard Canby are buried in Indiana, and always considered that to be their kind of home. Even though I'm not sure they spent much time there at all after Richard went into the Army, and they were mostly living in DC and other cities and forts and garrisons, but they are both buried in Indiana. But now, of course, the town is escaping me.
That reminds me, Gordon Granger, the military officer who was very famous last week for reading out the Juneteenth order, is buried in the Lexington Cemetery, married into a Kentucky family. He's one of these career military officers, right? Like, I don't know that the man spent hardly any time in Kentucky, because he's just bouncing around the country, but he's buried there. So we've got that.
Yeah.
Another question, after failing in their first campaign in the West, did the Confederates try again? And if they didn't, why?
Yeah. John Baylor, unsurprisingly, always wanted to come back. He actually ended up getting elected to Confederate Congress. And in 1865, he was in the midst of trying to get Jefferson Davis to devote more money to another campaign for New Mexico. He thought that he could really build this army, and there were constant rumors the Confederates were coming. And so Carleton had to, he had his armies that were fighting campaigns against Apaches and Navajos, and then he had other groups kind of posted in this kind of arc along the border of Texas, to try and make sure that no Texans tried to come up the Pecos River this time, or, once again, tried to launch themselves via the Rio Grande. In some ways, that was very useful, because he knew that they could only come along waterways because they could not survive otherwise. So that was useful for him in planning the defense. But there were always rumors, but they didn't really ever get it off the ground. And Baylor could not convince Davis by the end of the war to launch back in. And I think part of the reason for that was they really didn't have the manpower. And without the gold mines and the ports, they didn't have enough money to fund any more armies of invasion. Because I think Civil War historians agree that armies of invasion, you need to have, 2 to 3 times as many soldiers, and they have to be very well equipped. They have to be able to sustain themselves in order to sustain a campaign of invasion, and it's very difficult to do. So they had one shot, and it did not work out. Yeah.
Google says Louisa was born in Paris, Kentucky.
Oh.
Thanks, Dr. Google.
Interesting. Because I think also, so Baylor was also born in Paris.
Oh, there you go.
So she was born in Kentucky, but not, interesting. So so she must be like Canby in the sense, so he was also born in Kentucky at Plaque.
Yeah, and just hopping over.
And they went and moved to Indiana and then moved back.
We've got a really interesting question here that I think is motivated by the sort of the events that we've been seeing here recently, and this shift among historians, public art commissions in cities, mayors and the like, from moving away from contextualizing contentious monuments with waysides and signs and things like that, to moving towards removal now. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the shift in thinking that's sort of led us to this stage.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think the first move, and all of this discussion, Civil War historians have been talking about monuments a lot for basically since the field of memory studies got started, probably what do you think, 20 years ago?
Yeah, we're 20 years in, yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So we've been talking about monuments for a really long time, and using them as sources and using them as, evidence of kind of white supremacist kind of leanings and ideology and power in that period, especially that period of the 1890s, where Jim Crow really started to take hold. And I think the sort of push, though, it started a little bit with the Charleston murders of the parishioners in church, and then it really ramped up after Charlottesville. And in 2017, people, began to kind of discuss what to do with these pieces. And there was a strong argument, I think, coming from a lot of quarters for contextualization, that you just put up a plaque, you say, this is what this is for, this is what it is doing. Now, the argument against that was, no one's going to stop and read a plaque. So why don't we just get rid of it? It's a white supremacist symbol if it is a pro-Confederate monument. So why don't we just get rid of it? And then there are arguments, well, then where do you take it? Do you just destroy it? Do you dump it in a river? Do you send it to a museum? And, you know, we've been hearing on Twitter, I'm sure you've been seeing, Patrick, that there are all these museum professionals saying, we don't want it. What are we going to do with it? Like, what? How
fit it through the door?
How are we going to fit it through the door? How are we going to make, I mean, it's incredibly expensive to like keep them, you know, clean and sort of, and then how are we going to integrate this into the story our museum is telling? What are we supposed to do with this? And then there were arguments for, well, put them all together, put all the Confederate monuments together in some sort of Easter Island sort of situation where they can all hang out. So there was a lot of discussion about that. And I think what we've seen now is just a tipping point where everyone is saying, okay, enough. Like, these are our public spaces. They belong to a much larger and diverse group of people. And to have these monuments to white supremacy, like in our midst, even if they're contextualized, is just untenable anymore. And so we need to get rid of them, or we need to do something else with them. And I think the Lee Monument in Richmond is an amazing example of how because I've been arguing from the beginning that these sites should be given over to Black artists and activists to do with what they want. And if that means they contextualize them in their own way, then great. Or if they kind of take that material and create another sculpture, or, you know, however they choose to do it. And that is what activists have done with the Lee Memorial. Like, the fact that it is now, you know, covered with tagging that redefines it. And now they're showing these light shows, you know, with significant figures in African-American history. I mean, that's the kind of thing that I think is really interesting, I don't think it didn't happen in 2017. So I really think we have hit this point where now it is just unacceptable to have these things kind of in our midst. There's no reason for them anymore. And now it's up to the communities to kind of redefine that space. And I've even seen people on Twitter, you know, people are like, well, then we should put up monuments to these people. And then other people are saying, why do we even need more monuments? Can we just like have this as a new kind of space? Why don't we put something up there that's not a monument to a single person, but to a community, or it's just an artwork that's expressing something beautiful about America, you know? So I think there are a lot of options right now, but we have definitely reached a tipping point. I mean, I never thought I would see the day, actually. I
think that's been the consensus among all among historians who have been deep into monument culture for a very long time.
Yes.
And who have worked on those contextualization efforts in the past. And I know I have done that professionally, right? To have come here this quickly is really shocking.
Right. Yep.
Last question, and I hate it because we've got some really good ones down here in the chat, but we do have to watch for time. But I think this is a good one to head out west again. Should the Sand Creek Massacre be understood as a battle of the Civil War, especially as it is represented at the Colorado Capitol, speaking as a native Coloradan?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, Ari Kelman has written a brilliant book about this called The Misplaced Massacre, where yes, this has been a matter of contention. Is that massacre is it a Civil War action? And Ari's argument there is yes, it is. And that would be my argument as well, that this was a Union company that was actually organized by the hero of Glorieta Pass. John Chivington was the man who was responsible for burning the Confederate wagon train at Glorieta. He had, the idea was not his, but he led this kind of contingent of a third of these Colorado troops, and they they got that done. So, you know, he then goes from there to Denver City to then kind of be part of a home guard, and then puts together this group of 3rd Colorado Cavalry to go down there, and their only purpose was to kill Native peoples. But that was completely consonant with what was happening. I mean, at that same moment that Shivington and his troops are massacring Cheyenne Arapaho at Sand Creek, Kit Carson is leading the 1st New Mexico against Comanches and Kiowas at Adobe Walls. I mean, it's literally 3 days apart. And then just a few months later in Utah, California troops that had come over massacred Shoshones at Bear River. So, you know, this is happening across the West, and this is, Union troops are doing this, and they are considered Union troops, and they are part of the Union war effort.
All right, well, thank you for that quick answer. This one's too good not to throw out you real quick.
Okay.
Would you say that Manifest Destiny was the unifying factor that integrated the North, South, and West during the Civil War?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. I mean, definitely among Anglos. Let's be clear about that. Yeah, this was a driving vision of the future of the country. And, you know, Manifest Destiny is rooted in and necessitates the removal of Native peoples, if not outright extermination. So Native Westerners, and also I think perhaps to some extent Hispano Westerners, didn't have that same vision. But for Anglos, definitely, for white Northerners, white Southerners, and white Westerners, that brought them all together for sure.
Absolutely. All right, well, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I'm sure everyone else has as well. Virtual applause is ringing out for you across the Utah Valley region, I'm sure. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Patrick. Thank you, Filson. Thanks everyone for coming.
Have a great night.
Good night.